To John Calambokidis.
And you guys are lucky, like Howie was referring to, I get involved in strandings, and it seems like sometimes those seem to coincide with talks, as was the case today. So I think all of you heard about a gray whale that was found floating under the docks in Seattle. And I'll show you a few slides from that actually, that got emailed to me. And I had to make the choice of coming to give this presentation today or participating in that necropsy. I think when the American Cetacean Society had their biennial meeting a number of years ago in Seattle, it coincided with a fin whale stranding. And we could just barely squeeze it in, so I did the necropsy, but I arrived kind of dripping. And everyone kind of moved away from me. And so that almost could have occurred here, but Howie asked me to give me a little, kind of introduce myself and give you a little bit of background. And I came out here and started studying marine mammals when I was a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia. First got interested in harbor seals in the mid-1970s. So I started studying seals at that time, graduated from Evergreen in '78, and then started Cascadia Research with a number of other Evergreen graduates in 1979. And that's where I've worked since. It's a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. We now have about 20 employees and typically on average about 6 volunteers working with us at any time. We're based in Olympia, but some of our senior researchers like Robin Baird specialize not just in killer whales as we had in the past, but his main research these days is in Hawaii, on odontocetes in Hawaii. And my specialty has moved a little bit from pinnipeds to more the larger baleen whales. And everything we've heard about today has had, I think everything, if I think about it, has had teeth. And now I'm going to talk about the whales and cetaceans that don't have teeth, and I cover a couple of different species that I've been intensely studying in recent years. And I'm going to try to touch on a number of different things. So my research right now focuses on blue whales. I started studying blue whales and humpback whales in 1986 with an earlier speaker. When we got interested in studying humpback and blue whales, we tried to find who could we team up with, that had more expertise than we had. So we hooked up with this guy named Ken Balcom, which some of you may have heard of. And so we started our research in the Farallones, Gulf of the Farallones area of California on humpback whales in 1986. It was a partnership between Ken and at that time Prentice Blodell, and so Center for Whale Research was involved in Cascadia Research. And we bid against a number of other groups and were able to get this 3-year study to begin basically the first dedicated study of humpback whales off California at that time point. And it quickly turned into a study of humpback and blue whales, because as we quickly found out, that area was also home and a prime feeding ground for blue whales. And really what you're going to be seeing is some of the outgrowth of that work, as well as the local gray whales, which I know many of you are interested in. And I think part of what's so exciting about talking to an audience like this, I have trouble thinking of any other area, and I'm kind of racking my brains, where you have as much kind of citizen participation, citizen interest in the local marine mammals as we have in this region. And I'm sort of encompassing Whidbey Island, the San Juan Islands, and a lot of that from how accessible some of these animals are, from the killer whales observable from shore, the, of course, very large whale watching operations that go on here. But really it's amazing to see the level of participation Orca Network gets and the sighting network that Howie was referring to. So it's just neat to see people so engaged and interested in this region. And a pleasure to talk to you guys about it. Okay. And I'll kind of touch on some other things as we go on. So my kind of goal today is to talk about some of the long-term research we've been doing on these larger whales, including humpback and blue whales. And that's really going to cover what I'll call the eastern North Pacific. It's really the west coast area that I do a lot of that work, but touch into the Salish Sea and inside waters. And in particular, I'm going to highlight some of the recent research we've been trying to do on what we view as some of the more critical threats that exist to these animals. And I'm going to highlight two of them: ship noise and ship strikes as kind of one unit that are very related to each other, and then also Navy sonar. And I'm going to touch on those two things there. And especially the Navy sonar one, I'll be wandering a little bit afield. I'll be talking about a collaborative study called the SoCal Behavioral Response Study that we are a player in with a number of other research groups that's done out of California, but it's a threat that I think all of us are very concerned about. And then I want to come back, bring it back to a more local at the end and talk about gray whales in this region, not only some of what we've learned over the years, but also I think some exciting opportunities to do some more in-depth research coming up. So the kind of questions that we've gotten involved with, and really the questions we were asking when we started this work in the mid-'80s, are still very pertinent today for many large marine mammals. Abundance, how many of them are there? What are the trends? How are they recovering? Many of these species, in fact, humpback whales, for example, were hunted through 1966 off the U.S. West Coast from whaling stations that operated. We tend to think of whaling now as something, well, that's something that Japanese do, but this is something that was active in the lifespan of these whales, and really much of what we're studying in terms of their population and recovery is still from that threat. So long-term trends and how are they recovering from that, movements and migration. So I'm going to talk about that with both of these species just briefly, and then get right into these kind of the issue of some of the threats that exist. And this sort of captures more than about more than 25 years of research in a couple of slides here. First of all, what are the population size and trends? And on top you see humpback whales. And what you've got is estimates of abundance, and this is actually for the California-Oregon feeding aggregation. I'll show you some results from another study that showed that humpback whales form these relatively discrete feeding aggregations. In other words, the animals that feed off California, Oregon, and Washington 1 year don't then wander up and feed off Alaska another year. They tend to be loyal to these feeding areas and return to them. So this is for that kind of main feeding aggregation that feeds off California, Oregon. And we have similar data for Washington, but it's a much smaller unit and it merges into British Columbia. And what you'll see here is from when we started our work, and I really started this timeline in the early 90s because when we started the work in the 80s with Ken, we were very focused in one area. And it wasn't until the early 90s that we kind of recognized the full range of movements of these animals and kind of started studying in a way that gave us an accurate, full population estimate for that feeding aggregation. And like many of the studies we've heard today, the focus of this research was photographic identification of individual animals. In the case of blue whales, using the underside of the fluke. In the case of humpback whales, in the case of blue whales, using the pigment patterns on the side of the animals. And so it went from the early 90s, an estimated population of about 500 animals, to now somewhere around 2,000. Interestingly, you'll see that we actually had better estimates in the early years of our research than we do now. And partly that's a function of the fact that we no longer get dedicated research, just dedicated funding for the population component. But it also reflects the fact that as the population grows bigger, it's harder to get as representative and accurate a sample. But nothing changes the trend, which looks like about a 7% per year trend, with maybe a slight indication by a couple of the, and I'm not going to go into detail, you see 3 different lines plotted there that seem to be diverging a little bit at the end. And those are actually the result of 3 different statistical procedures of how we've tried to estimate abundance from these photo IDs using different mark recapture techniques. But there's just a little bit of a hint in 2 of them that the population may be leveling off. And indeed, we might expect that, especially when I show you what's going on in the North Pacific as a whole, that humpback whales, much like gray whales did in the late 90s, may be reaching their kind of recovered level, and we're going to see a dramatic change in their population parameters. The picture with blue whales has been much more confusing. Our photo ID data has suggested a fairly stable number of animals, about 2,000 animals. But interestingly, you'll see one set of lines that actually comes from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center line transect surveys, where they just estimate an instantaneous abundance based on density. based on their surveys, and it's actually shown a substantial decrease in blue whales along the West Coast waters from the 1990s to the 2000s. We think that what explains these two patterns is that in the 1990s, the majority of the blue whales tended to feed along the US West Coast and not range too much farther. They would migrate south in winter, but they weren't really going up into British Columbia and Alaskan waters, areas where they used to be common during whaling days. And sightings from those areas post-whaling were pretty rare. And during the 1990s and 80s, we thought maybe that was because that was a separate group of animals that did that, that maybe got wiped out in whaling. Well, since then, we've gathered a lot more data, and we have now matches that show it's these same whales that go all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska and all the way down to the Costa Rica Dome off Central America for blue whales. And really, we think this difference is the fact that what's happened is in the 2000s, the blue whales just didn't tend to be as concentrated off the US West Coast, and were feeding more in some of these further north and further south areas. So they were getting basically missed in these line transect surveys, but still captured in our photo ID long-term survey. There was a paper that came out last year that kind of highlighted it. It used a lot of our data, but it also linked it to whaling data, and it got quite a bit of publicity in the fact it reported that, you know, based on these population models and past whaling data, it tried to substantiate that blue whales had perhaps reached that historical pre-whaling number in the eastern North Pacific and were stable for that reason. We've been concerned about, you know, other threats, and you'll see some of our data on ship strikes that have worried us that these animals are still facing some major threats and potentially should be recovering more than they are. But right now, those are two sort of competing hypotheses on that. Yeah, let me go on from here. I want to link our kind of information on humpback whales off this west coast and how they're recovering to an effort we did in the mid-2000s, so now almost going back 10 years, called SPLASH, and it was the largest collaborative study of researchers that we know that's been conducted on whales. It involved over 400 participants, researchers gathering photo IDs throughout the North Pacific, some from a wide variety of platforms, from ships to small boats to even outrigger canoes in the case of the Philippines. And data was gathered in the Philippines, off Japan, Russia, Alaska, British Columbia, the whole US West Coast, Mexico, Central America, and Hawaii. So it covered all of these different breeding and feeding areas for humpback whales. And some interesting results. For example, these lines connect the re-sightings of individually identified whales. So where you see a line, it means it's connecting where a whale was seen in two places, and we've connected it with a line. That doesn't mean that's the route it traveled, but it went between those areas. It'd be a little troubling, I know. But. And the color coding has to do with what winter area did they come from. So you see our Central America animals down here tended to heavily come here to Southern California, but a few came up as far north as Washington. Mexico has an interesting, more complicated situation where there's a coastal area off Baja and offshore islands called the Rey Valledos that are all used in winter months by humpback whales. And interestingly, very different patterns of movements, especially these offshore animals, tend to not come to the US West Coast and actually travel a pretty broadly dispersed set of feeding areas those animals migrate to that actually is in contrast to Hawaii. I mean, you can kind of see how animals from these Rey Valledos, while some of them come up this way, they actually kind of cross the path of some of these animals migrating from Hawaii to Southeast Alaska. And really what this picture changed is there had been research done going back decades before our SPLASH study that had identified connections between a few of these areas. For example, matches between Hawaii and Southeast Alaska had been identified with photo ID, and there were some from California to Mexico and Central America. But what was missing was we tended to take those isolated comparisons and think, okay, in fact, even how NOAA managed humpback whales, they initially said, okay, there's a Hawaii, Southeast Alaska population of humpback whales, and there's a California, Central America population. And what SPLASH revealed is that these migration patterns are far more complex than that. It isn't, all the animals going from one breeding area go to one feeding area. You can see that if you take any area, like up here in the Gulf of Alaska, it can be animals coming from any of the 3 wintering areas, all converging on that spot to feed. And similar, animals wintering in Hawaii could be coming from British Columbia all the way over to Russia. So, and yet the genetics, you might be tempted to look at this and say, okay, well, these animals are just wandering more randomly among these areas. But the genetics show that these animals were pretty loyal. They were loyal to their feeding areas and they were loyal to their breeding areas. So you didn't see, you had a few of these animals that in opposite years would go to Mexico and Hawaii, but they were rare enough that really the genetics stood out pretty distinctly, showing that these animals were loyal in the areas they returned to. Well, it kind of puts management in a little bit of a conundrum, because on the one hand, you don't want to manage it all as one unit, because that would imply that if you had an isolated threat in one region, that area could be quickly repopulated by animals from another area. That's not the case based on the genetics. Yet it's hard to draw nice clear lines and say this is one population unit. So right now that's still something that's being struggled with, but the SPLASH study was really good at identifying that this really was a pretty complex picture. You had this intermixture of loyalty to specific areas, but also this, what we'll term a mixed stock kind of structure for humpback whales. Now, we also came up with the kind of first comprehensive estimate of the North Pacific humpback whale population. And again, there are many variations, and we had different years, but the bottom line was about 20 to 21,000 humpback whales in the mid-2000s. That more than tripled what was the best previous estimate of how many humpback whales were in the North Pacific. And so it gave us a more accurate estimate of the abundance. It still showed that humpback whales in some areas, and in particularly the Western Pacific, around Japan and Russia and the Philippines, that population still remained very small. So while these studies that we've done and the SPLASH study have suggested humpback whales have recovered very nicely in some areas, because there's this structure and because there's certain areas that they haven't recovered very well, we still need to be very conscious of not just downlisting humpbacks as a whole, but potentially looking at protecting certain areas. And it would make sense areas like Asia and off Japan would still be a threat. There's a still pretty high level of mortality of humpback whales off Japan waters, many of it with humpbacks being entangled in fishing nets and other mortalities, now that especially they can actually sell that meat if they catch a humpback whale in a net. And so use it in that way. So there's not much of a negative incentive. If anything, there's a positive incentive for catching humpbacks in those waters. I just want to point out again a lot of data, but the main take-home message here is this is looking at how our estimates compared to past estimates, going all the way back to one that Dale Rice did in 1966, right kind of at the end of that main period of commercial whaling. And he estimated there were about 1,400 humpback whales. So if you plug that in with our more recent estimates, it really came out at a pretty reasonable 7% per year increase to get back up to where we were in the mid-2000s. And that matched really well with our West Coast data. And we could do that for Hawaii, we could do that for Mexico, and all of them tended to be in that 5 to 7% per year recovery humpback whales were making in all of these areas. Now, how does that tie into this area here? Well, it's kind of exciting. I think some of the whale watch boats and what we're seeing is more humpback whales being seen in more inside waters, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, areas like even Puget Sound that humpbacks come into. And that was an area that prior to some of the whaling activities, humpbacks used to be more common. They were even whaled through the winter in some of the Washington inside waters. And so I think as we see the recovery of these populations, we're going to see, I think, more of a return of humpback whales. But that loyalty I mentioned about humpback whales tend to like certain areas and return to them, I think is going to maybe slow that process. That will occur gradually as opposed to suddenly, because humpback whales do tend to prefer and use certain areas on a more loyal basis. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about a technique we've been using quite a bit in addition to photo ID. You know, when we did photo ID in our small boat surveys, you know, we were getting this very nice snapshot of what whales were doing at the surface, but what they were doing underwater and the majority of their behavior was a mystery to us. And really, starting with the National Geographic Critter Cam, increasingly tags were giving us an insight into that. And, you know, and it's important when you hear tagging to know that there are many flavors of tags and many differences in how they're attached and used. They range from what would be the more benign, which would be attached with a suction cup, but I want to emphasize even there, what you're doing has some level of impact on the animal. You have to approach closely, and I'll show you how we attach these tags to the animal, so there's a level of disturbance. And even as you have these suction cups attached for longer periods, you can actually see where it does cause a visible mark on the skin. You've also, some of you are familiar with killer whales, know of these limpet satellite tags. They're tags that are small external tags. They're attached with darts for a medium duration, so I would call that a more intermediate kind of impact tag. And then a third kind of tagging that actually goes even further back in time are more deep implant tags. This is along the West Coast. The primary researcher using that has been Bruce Mate at Oregon State University. And these are tags to try to get durations of a year or more. But to achieve that, they actually implant the tag goes actually into the muscle layer with most of the tag in the body and the antenna coming out. And that's the highest level of impact. And you know, that's a type of tagging I've been very concerned about. We actually have a study going on right now using our long-term databases with gray whale, humpback, and blue whale to document all of the animals that have been tagged in Bruce's program and look at their follow-up histories and both what that tag site looks like, because some of these numbers are pretty large. In the case of blue whales, over 180 blue whales have had these implant satellite tags attached to them. So we have a pretty large set of data, and also some of the gray whales, not that are in Puget Sound, but that feed off the Oregon and Washington coast, have had these tags. And so we have some new data coming out on that. And what it suggests is that there is some impact from these tags that have to be taken seriously, these deep implant tags. Okay. So I think I want to show you a little bit of video, first of all, to just kind of go back and both show how we attach these tags. The tags can have a wide variety of sensors on them, so we've used them to get really basic data like dive depth. But now increasingly they have advanced sensors on them. But the ones that kind of give you the most visually exciting, of course, is those that have video cameras attached to them. So first let's just look at going back. Now this is work we did in the early to mid 2000s. And this is deploying a critter cam that's much larger. It's a video camera going on a blue whale. It's actually sucked down with active suction. We're going to hear some, this is the flow noise. It has a microphone in it. And this is the tag on the pole. Here it is going on the whale right here. Now we're on the back of the whale. And the tag naturally weather vanes to point forward. These body undulations you see are the whale's swimming motion. When it beats its fluke, the whole body goes up and down. I mean, the amazing thing for me is after studying these animals 10, 15 years, this was my first view of what really life was like for these animals. So now this whale is coming up for a final breath here. So this is its kind of terminal surfacing, and it begins diving down. It'll take a couple of fluke beats, that's these body undulations, right there. And then one thing we learned right off the bat is these animals, especially once they get below about 10, 20 meters, are negatively buoyant. So the animal will accelerate going downward now without beating its flukes. You can see it stop beating its flukes. Now first you'll hear that irritating noise. That's the flow noise. At first we thought that was just kind of an irritant, but it actually turned out we could calibrate that flow noise to an exact speed. This was work that Jeremy Goldhagen, a postdoc at Scripps, and then with Cascadia did. The other thing we learned that was brilliant, of course, was that it gets pretty dark down there. Maybe we ought to put some lights on those things. But even when that was the case, you'll see this animal, it's going down, and when it angles towards the surface, you're going to see it silhouetted in the upper left hand, and I want you to listen to the sound when it does that. So it's down, going down, it's about to turn up right there. So I don't know if you can tell from that, but what happened there is the animal brought its head back. That was the animal engulfing a large volume of krill, and the flow noise immediately decreased. So right away we determined that that audio that is a proxy for flow noise could be used to detect these lunge feeding events. It was the only thing causing the animal to rapidly become motionless. And I'll show you some other video that shows you why that's the case. When it opens up its mouth, it's almost like a parachute opening. And then the whale will do a series of these lunges like this. And I'm going to show you a couple of images, and then, again, this is from a while ago. I'm going to show you some more recent stuff that's a little bit nicer than this, but you got to do it in this order. And anyway, so this video goes on. We'll probably see one more lunge. I may jump ahead here in a second. Yes, here's another lunge. And again, you can hear that flow noise drops off. That was another lunge. So anyway, we were thrilled by this. We published a paper on it. We thought it was great stuff. National Geographic never used that. They were just horribly disappointed in that. And you know, a lot of this video comes out like this. This is an animal actually lunge feeding near the surface. You can see how kind of shaky this is. That's its pec fin on the left. It's just done a lunge. Right there, you can actually see some krill swirling around. You'll appreciate the kind of better optics we get later. But that's an animal doing a lunge near the surface. Here's another kind of more surface lunge. Again, that's the pectoral fin. It's using that to steer an angle as it takes this steep vertical movement towards the surface. And then here, where it'll do a lunge, you'll actually see the head break the surface right here briefly, where it does the lunge right there. It's lunging a krill, and that's it breaking the surface. You'll actually see some krill on its back there, wriggling out of the water. You know, and this is what this animal is just engulfed. Okay, maybe we'll cut off that old video right at that point there. But you kind of get the idea. I did want to show you now these tags we're currently using are much smaller. So this is a Woods Hole D-tag deployed just this past September. This is Ari Freelander. It's a tag on his head. I'm driving the boat. We have a lunge feeding blue whale right here. He's reversing the tag on the pole. And then we're just positioning by this lunge feeding whale here and waiting for it to come up for another breath. And the tag went on right there. That was the tag going on. He's quickly grabbing another tag because it's two whales, and you'll actually see there's the whale right there, still right there, with its throat cleats fully engulfing that krill. And he's getting another tag ready, and we're actually going to maneuver around and tag the other animal.
Other whales here, John. I'm set up.
So he's ready to go. And we actually get another tag out in a moment there, but let's move. And then here's my, I had a camera going that I won't show you, but then I also had one on a pole that I quickly, right when we deployed that tag, I stuck another camera in the water here. So there's that blue whale with the tag on it near the head. So you can see this animal is just here. It's fully engulfed this prey. It's just basically sitting there. It's slowly going to, you know, contract that throat area. It increases its body volume by, you know, more than twofold, and then push that through its baleen. And now I got to put the camera away so we can maneuver over to the other hand. Who was that? Now, I'm going to be talking in a second about how we're using these tags to both look at how these animals react to ship noise, how they respond to close approaches of ships that can be threatening a ship strike, and also how they respond to sonar. So I'll give you more information on that in a second, but I did want to, on these same deployments, there was playback of sonar. And so this is these same animals, and you'll get to actually hear, this is a whale with a tag on it, and we're just kind of filming it. And then if we listen, we'll actually hear the playback of mid-frequency sonar. So that's mid-frequency sonar. That's a simulation of what real Navy destroyers play. We have a sound source that can play that, You can only play it at about 100th as loud as a real Navy ship can. And it's not being played from our boat, it's being played from several kilometers away, but it's being picked up. And so anyway, this is part of this study that there's another playback of the sonar. So as I described that study to you, we've been doing that with this kind of, if you will, little mini sound source that we have to do that. And then more importantly, recently,